Okay, hello everybody and welcome back to another theory video on my custom chess position, What's Your Decision? In this video, it's a little bit just of an expansion to my video 1e4 theory expanded. And in that video I discussed, so first things first, if you haven't seen that, it makes sense to view that video first because I won't be covering what was covered in that video before explaining this one. But essentially in that video, so let me just go through a few moves. So yeah, there's this bishop f3 move, um, which after e5 was aiming at b7, and then black played c6, and the bishop is not coming to b5, whereas white will put their bishop on g4. And in that video, I kind of discussed lines where black's bishop was indeed on b5 and white's bishop was on g4, and we uncovered the ideas of taking this knight on e6, and then once black takes back, slowly moving the king to safety after playing g4 and then trying to push forward with the pawns. And we kind of concluded in positions like that, black doesn't really have much of a plan. However, they have lots of pieces because they can free their queen and bishop once white takes on e6. They have a lot of pieces able to stop the promotion, and both sides have chances, although black doesn't really have a plan. And then so we showed ideas where black can also take on d3, and then it becomes a pawn promotion battle as both sides have freed the queen and bishop. And we also discussed a tactic um, where after taking the knight on e6, we can take on b4 here, and then on d4, and we can kind of free our white, for example, but either side can employ this plan. Just blacks would be on this g5 pawn and the d3 knight. But basically, white can sacrifice a couple of minor pieces in order to get their queen and bishop out as well. However, black's king is exposed, and that kind of makes up for the fact that, well, black's queen and bishop are out as well, but black didn't have to sacrifice any material. And also these pawns for white are strong over here, whereas black's pawn cover gets taken out in those variations. I didn't discuss too much about lines where the bishop is not on b5, and the bishop is just on, for example, d7. And if we were to mirror this, since these positions are fairly symmetrical, it would be, for example, white's bishop is on e2 and black's is on b5. And basically in a position like this, I just wanted to cover a couple key factors. So the first thing right now is that bishop takes e6 lines, and I've put a note here where black's bishop isn't on b5. If we follow some lines, it appears white isn't able to break through for a promotion, so it's best to go with knight takes b4 and bishop takes e6 ideas. So for example, just putting some moves forward. And see, black basically can't really do anything, so they're just going back and forth, and white has all the time in the world to come up with their best way to push forward for pawn promotion. But we can see that even in where white makes a setup with, for example, the rooks kind of ready to help in the promotion, for example, in a line like this, the engine says black is a little bit better. And where the bishop was on b5, a position like this would have chances for both sides, and maybe white even slightly better. But now that this bishop is better placed to stop the promotion, in positions like this, the computer thinks it's not worth it for white to try and go for the promotion. Even over here, where I think at some point king g2 was shown as a main move. Even this, after a few more moves, the engine realizes that white doesn't really have anything to push forward here. Of course, it's not saying that white is losing or anything, but generally where the bishop's on d7, for example, it shows that it's not as favorable for white to try and go for the promotion, whereas when the bishop was on b5, that was a valid idea. But if we go all the way back, we have to go back several moves, but what white can do in a position like this is, after a few more moves, for example, white brings the rook to d1, and now white can kind of go for the taking on e6 and taking on b4 idea. And white can actually do this one move earlier, because normally when black's bishop is on b5, it kind of sees this rook, so white has to spend another move to move the rook out of the way, but now white doesn't need to. And if we look at these ideas, because like black would like to take on g5 themselves, but if they're not able to take this bishop on d3, normally that sacrifice doesn't work out. Like for example, let's say if white played rook e1 right now, and then black took on g5, then we can see that after, for example, f takes g5, let's say that black takes here on e5. Actually, it's saying for a knight to take on c5, but also the knight can take on e5. And it still wants knight takes c5. Let's see here. And we can take on e5 here. So you can see with this knight not traded off, it kind of becomes hard for black to kind of push forward with their own sacrifice. So going back to the main line, if black doesn't really have any sort of sacrifice, they don't really have too much of a plan. If they were to try to reroute their pieces, for example, bring this knight to d7 somehow and bring a bishop to d8, all this, they'd have to move a bunch of pieces backwards, and this would just allow for taking on c5 and then on d4, taking on b4. So essentially, black just has to put their pieces in the center, which they've done, and hope that white has nothing. But white is the only side that has a plan over here, which is why the engine and I prefer the bishops to be on g4 and b5 if possible, just because it allows more flexibility. So here white can play bishop takes e6, and the thing is, because black doesn't really have a plan, white doesn't even have to do this like right away. They could play rook e1, bishop f2. Of course, black will try to play bishop c8 so that this rook more closely sees this d4 pawn. Maybe they'll play bishop c7. So black also has a few like moves they can try to improve. But we have bishop takes c6, for example, here, and this is not the only move that can be played. This is just an example, but it kind of shows the plans over here. So f takes e6 is played. Knight takes b4. And see, right now the engine's saying that black is better, but the engine then realizes that white has a decent legitimate chance with this sacrifice and starts to change the evaluation more to what it should be. After king takes b4, which is a blunder, we just have bishop takes d4, and black is completely lost. So the only move here is c takes. Bishop takes d4, c5, and over here the computer likes knight takes c3 better, but sometimes it will like bishop takes c3, and you can see over here the engine is saying that bishop takes c3 is slightly better for black. So it's not like white is winning or anything in this sort of sacrifice, even though black doesn't really have a plan and white just going forward with the sacrifice. Even with this move that the engine right now is liking white a bit better, it's not winning or anything like that. So we have knight takes c3, c takes d4, knight takes d5, e takes d5, rook takes d4, b5, for example. So b5, c3, b takes, queen takes c3, king b6, b4, a5 takes, king a6, queen takes a3, bishop g6. These are all like example moves, bishop d3. And see, after this position, engine still says white is slightly better. If we look at material, we see that, okay, both sides have 2 rooks and a queen, but black has 3 bishops, so white only has 1. However, black's king is a lot more in danger than white's king, which is fairly safe considering the circumstances. And white's pawns are not only quite in a strong position, but white could eventually push forward for like some sort of promotion, where black's is much harder for a promotion. And even right now, the engine here is saying in this particular line I put out on the board here that white is over +1, and definitely white has a lot of threats for their being behind in material. And even now that I say behind in material, I think all their pawns and actually the materials even. So going back, another line, rook c8, rook takes b4 is actually can be played in if the king takes. So these get very tactical, but white wins back the piece, and so black shouldn't accept this. They go b5, rook d4, bishop g6, and these are just sample lines. c4, just trying to break through the position and expose the king. Rook d1, queen f8, then they sack for that, and bishop e4. So white is just trying everything to expose the king, trade off the pieces, and even though in this position black's actually up a rook and a bishop over here, white's pawns and stuff like compensate as well, and even here the engine's actually liking white better. And if we go all the way back to the main crux of this position, that is normally why the engine likes the bishop to be on b5, because I guess the difference would be now is when the bishop, white would have the same types of sacrifices actually as before. However, if white were to take on e6, black could take on d3 as well, and then force a proportion battle, which white has one extra tempo, but it's only a very, very slight advantage. So basically black can kind of enforce the same sort of plans. I'm sorry, black can do the same stuff as white. Over here, black is kind of at the mercy of white almost. And yeah, but even when the bishop's on b5, I mean the same sacrifice taking on e6 and taking on b4, for example, these sacrifices still work, but just black has a few more options because they can use that bishop. So yeah, that's kind of just what I wanted to cover for today. So just a short video. I've been making shorter update videos recently, just whenever I find a new idea and make some updates to my big I have several files now on different lines of theory for this position. Just like to put an update over here, so to show the current state of theory in this position, which is ever expanding. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed that, and that is it for now. And if you go to the playlist section on my channel, you can see I've put all these videos. I think this is the 21st video, but I put them all in a playlist, so you can see all the theory videos in this position and choose whichever one you want to see. So yeah, that's all for now.